What if the first village was not built because humans suddenly became civilized, but because one small group discovered that staying in one place could be more useful than constantly moving? For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived by following animals, gathering plants, fishing, and moving when food became scarce. Then, almost without anyone realizing it, something changed. People began returning to the same places again and again. They built shelters, stored food, buried their dead, and eventually started living beside one another for much longer than a season. But why would a species that had survived so well on the move suddenly decide to stay? And perhaps even more strangely, how did the first permanent village actually come into existence? To understand that moment, we have to forget the image of early humans living in simple caves and suddenly waking up one morning to invent houses. The real story was much slower. There was no single person who decided that humans should build a village. There was no blueprint, no architect, and probably no clear idea of what a village would become. Instead, settlement grew out of thousands of small decisions made over many generations. A good hunting ground was visited repeatedly. A reliable spring attracted people. A river provided fish. A valley offered wild grains. A sheltered place became familiar. And when the same people kept returning to the same location, temporary camps slowly began to look less temporary. For most of human history, mobility was not a problem that needed solving. It was a survival strategy. Hunter-gatherers could move towards seasonal plants, follow migrating animals, and leave an area before its resources were exhausted. Carrying everything they owned also made sense. If your family needed to move tomorrow, you could not afford to own much more than you could carry. But this lifestyle had another advantage that is easy to overlook. It allowed people to escape difficult conditions. If food became scarce, the group could move. If conflict developed, people could separate. If a water source dried up, there was another place to search. Staying in one location meant giving up some of that flexibility. So the first villages did not appear because humans simply became smarter. Humans were already remarkably capable. The real change was environmental. As the last ice age came to an end, the world began changing dramatically. Around 11,700 years ago, the current geological period, the Holocene, began. Temperatures became generally warmer and more stable than during the Ice Age. In parts of the Near East, wild grasses became abundant, and animals such as gazelles gathered in predictable areas. For people who knew these landscapes intimately, that predictability was incredibly valuable. Suddenly, certain places could provide food again and again, and this created a strange possibility. If a place could provide enough food for much of the year, why leave? At first, people did not necessarily stop moving completely. They could spend longer periods in favored locations and make shorter trips to nearby areas. A camp used for a few weeks might become a seasonal base. A seasonal base might be occupied for several months. Over generations, people could begin investing more effort into the same place because they expected to return. That investment was the beginning of something revolutionary, a reason to build things that were difficult to carry away. One of the clearest clues comes from archaeology. At sites across the ancient Near East, archaeologists have found evidence of increasingly permanent settlements long before the first cities appeared. One of the most famous examples is Jericho, located near a natural spring in the Jordan Valley. People occupied the area thousands of years ago, and over time the settlement developed substantial structures. Another remarkable site is Gobekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, where monumental stone structures were built more than 11,000 years ago. These sites do not tell a simple story in which agriculture immediately created villages and villages immediately created civilization. Instead, they reveal something much more interesting. Humans were experimenting with staying together before the full agricultural revolution had transformed their lives. Imagine arriving at one of these early settlements thousands of years ago. You would not see streets filled with cars or houses arranged like a modern neighborhood. You might see simple structures made from mud, stone, wood, reeds, or other local materials. Smoke would rise from hearths. People would process food, make tools, care for children, repair shelters, and prepare for the next day. Dogs may have been present in some communities, living alongside humans as domestication developed. The settlement would not necessarily look impressive, but something profound would be happening. People were beginning to shape the landscape around a place they expected to remain in. Then came one of the biggest changes in human history, agriculture. For a long time, people had gathered wild plants and understood their seasonal cycles. They knew when grasses ripened, where particular plants grew, and which seeds were worth collecting. Eventually, in several regions, humans began cultivating plants and managing animals. In the Fertile Crescent, early farmers domesticated crops such as wheat and barley and animals including sheep and goats. But agriculture was not a single invention that spread instantly across the world. Different populations adopted farming at different times, and some communities continued hunting and gathering for thousands of years alongside cultivation. Agriculture made permanent settlement more practical, but it also created a surprising problem. Farming sounds like an obvious improvement when we look backward. Plant a crop, harvest it, store the food, and stay home. But early farming was hard work. Fields needed to be cleared and prepared. Crops needed care. Harvests could fail. Stored food could attract pests. A drought could destroy an entire season's work. Early farmers also had to defend their food stores and animals, so why make the change? The answer is probably not that farming was immediately easier. Instead, farming offered something mobility could not easily provide: the ability to produce and store a predictable surplus in one location. And surplus changed everything. If a community produced more food than it needed immediately, that food could be stored for later. Storage created a reason to protect a place. It also created a reason for people to cooperate. Someone had to harvest, someone had to process grain, someone had to make tools, someone had to watch animals, someone had to maintain shelters. Children needed care, the sick needed help. The more permanent a community became, the more interconnected these tasks became. A village was not simply a collection of houses. It was a network of people depending on one another. But there was another hidden force pushing humans toward permanent settlement: family. When people stayed longer in one place, they could build stronger social connections to that location. The dead could be buried nearby. Homes could be repaired instead of abandoned. Children could grow up surrounded by the same relatives and neighbors. Places could become meaningful because people had memories there. A landscape was no longer just a route between food sources. It could become home. This is where the story becomes especially fascinating. Archaeologists have found evidence that some early communities buried their dead within or near their settlements. In certain ancient Near Eastern societies, human remains were sometimes placed beneath floors or inside buildings. Imagine what that means. A house was no longer just a shelter. It could become a place connected to ancestors. The physical landscape began carrying history. People were not simply living somewhere. They were creating a place that belonged to generations. Yet permanent settlement brought a new problem that hunter-gatherers had not faced in quite the same way: waste. When a small group moves regularly, waste is left behind as the group travels. But when hundreds of people remain in one place for years or generations, everything accumulates. Food scraps, broken tools, animal remains, ash, building debris, and human waste can pile up. Archaeologists can actually detect these layers today. Some ancient settlements became enormous mounds because people repeatedly built new structures over older ones. What looks like a natural hill can sometimes be the accumulated remains of thousands of years of human life. And then there was conflict. When people moved frequently, disputes could sometimes be resolved simply by separating. Permanent settlements changed that equation. Now people had homes, stored food, animals, fields, tools, and places that mattered to them. These things could be defended, stolen, or fought over. Archaeological evidence from some early settlements shows walls, defensive structures, and injuries that may point to episodes of violence. But we should be careful. Early villages were not necessarily constantly at war. Cooperation was essential to survival, and many communities appear to have lived for long periods without obvious signs of organized warfare. One of the biggest surprises is that the first village may not have been created by farming at all. At places such as the ancient settlement of Jericho, people were living in substantial communities while the transition to agriculture was still developing. Earlier hunter-gatherer societies known as the Natufians, who lived in parts of the Levant more than 12,000 years ago, built relatively substantial settlements and appear to have occupied some locations for extended periods. They gathered wild cereals and other plants, hunted animals, and developed increasingly complex social lives. This suggests that the road to the village began before full-scale farming. That changes the entire story. Perhaps humans did not invent villages because agriculture forced them to stay. Perhaps agriculture and permanent settlement developed together, each reinforcing the other. Once people stayed longer, they had more reason to cultivate plants. Once they cultivated plants, they had more reason to stay and protect their fields. Once they stored food, they had more reason to build permanent structures. Once permanent structures existed, people could accumulate possessions and develop stronger connections to the location. Each change pushed the next one forward, and there was an even deeper transformation taking place. A mobile group has to think about tomorrow's journey. A permanent community has to think about next year's harvest. That difference sounds small, but it changes how people organize their lives. Instead of simply asking where food is today, people begin planning months ahead. Seeds must be saved, animals must be managed, storage must be maintained, buildings must be repaired, Water must be controlled. Knowledge must be passed from one generation to the next. Time itself begins to feel different when your community has a future tied to one place. As villages grew, social relationships became more complicated. A small band of relatives can operate through personal relationships and shared traditions. But once dozens or hundreds of people live together, new problems appear. Who owns the stored grain? Who decides where a house can be built? Who settles disputes? Who organizes communal work? Who receives food during a bad harvest? We should not imagine that early villages immediately developed kings and governments. Those institutions came much later and in different forms. But permanent settlement created the conditions in which increasingly complex forms of organization could emerge. The physical design of villages also began changing. Houses could be rebuilt, expanded, and connected. Storage areas became important. Paths formed naturally between buildings. Communal spaces appeared. In some places, buildings seem to have had purposes beyond ordinary domestic life. Gobekli Tepe is especially important here because its monumental structures suggest that large groups could organize major construction projects before cities existed. The site does not prove that religion caused civilization or that people stopped hunting because of it. But it does show that early communities were capable of extraordinary cooperation. Think about what building a large stone structure actually requires. People have to find suitable stone, extract or shape it, move heavy blocks, prepare the site, and coordinate many individuals. Someone has to know how the work should be done. Others have to provide food while the builders work. People must agree at least enough to spend enormous amounts of energy on something that is not simply a shelter. That level of cooperation reveals a major change in human society. The village was becoming more than a place where people slept. It was becoming a shared project. But perhaps the most important discovery is that there was no single first village that suddenly changed humanity forever. Human settlement emerged through a long, messy process with many experiments. Some communities became permanent, others remained mobile. Some groups farmed while still hunting. Some settled near rivers or springs. Others lived in environments where seasonal movement remained essential. There was no universal path that every human society followed. Eventually, however, some of these communities became large enough to transform into something entirely new. Villages grew, trade networks expanded. Crafts became more specialized. Population increased. Agricultural production intensified. Some settlements developed social hierarchies and monumental architecture. And after thousands of years of gradual change, the first cities began to emerge in places such as Mesopotamia. Cities were not an invention that appeared out of nowhere. They were the distant descendants of countless small decisions made by people who had once simply decided to stay. So how did humans build the first village? The simplest answer is that they built it one decision at a time. They found places with reliable food and water. They returned to those places repeatedly. They built shelters that were worth maintaining. They stored resources. They cultivated plants and managed animals. They raised children, buried their dead, cooperated with neighbors, argued with neighbors, repaired their homes, and eventually began thinking of one patch of land as home. The truly revolutionary invention was not the wall, the roof, or even the first field. It was permanence itself. For hundreds of thousands of years, human survival depended heavily on the ability to move. Then in several parts of the world, some communities discovered that staying could also be a powerful strategy. Once people stayed, they could build. Once they could build, they could store. Once they could store, they could plan. And once they could plan together across generations, the foundations of civilization were already being laid. The first village may have looked small compared with the cities we live in today. There were no skyscrapers, highways, or electric lights. But somewhere among those simple shelters, hearths, fields, and storage pits was an idea that would eventually reshape the planet. The idea that a group of humans could choose a place, invest their labor into it, and make it home. Thousands of years later, we still do the same thing. We build houses, neighborhoods, towns, and cities, often without realizing how ancient the instinct really is. The first village was not built in a single day, and civilization did not begin with one brilliant invention. It began when humans started imagining a future in the same place. And once our ancestors stopped asking only, where can we find food, and began asking, what can we build here for tomorrow? The world was never quite the same again.